This is Larry Jordan, the host of the Digital Production Buzz. The following interview is an excerpt from a recent program. To hear the entire program, visit digitalproductionbuzz.com. Kevin McAuliffe is the senior editor for Extreme Reach Toronto. He's also an avid community leader with close to 20 years of media composer experience. Kevin uses his knowledge to help educate not only the avid community, but editors currently looking to make a switch to media composer. Hello, Kevin. Welcome.
Larry, thanks for having me. Michael, good to talk to you again as well.
Hiya, Kevin. We were worried about you for a second. Couldn't get a hold of you. Yeah.
I know. I was sitting up here waiting for the Skype call to come through, but it's funny because I was listening to that last interview, and you know what? I'll sing the praises of Audio-Technica because I'm actually talking to you on one of their microphones right now, and it's fabulous. I love it.
Oh,
see,
yeah, who doesn't?
He is a multi-talented individual. Kevin, just to get ourselves started, what got you interested in editing in the first place?
Oh, there's a great story. It's funny, nobody ever asked me that story. It's always a good one. When I was about 14 years old, my parents took me to Universal Studios in California, and I did this thing called the Star Trek experience. Mm-hmm. And basically, they took you and they dressed you up like, you know, I was a Klingon, basically. But they actually made a little 10-minute video, and it was one of those things where I sort of saw all the cameras and I saw the stuff, and I thought to myself, that's something I got to do. You know what? I was totally amazed at how they put this thing together. I still have the video from like way back then. I came back home and I said to my parents, I don't know what aspect of film television I want to do, but that's what I want to do. And believe it or not, at the time, this was, well, let's see, this was about when I was 15, so, you know, what, 25 years ago. They looked up to see how many schools offered this. And believe it or not, there was a school in Ontario, Canada, one school, high school, that had a television studio in it. We were still using, are you ready for this? Video toaster. Video toaster. Editing on video toaster with all those fantastic wipes with the football player and stuff like that. But that sort of gave me my first, you know, real look at everything that went into television. And editing was always one of those things that kind of scared me because you had those giant tape decks, you know, that were like, you know, 400 pounds that you had to slam the tape in at the top, you know, 3/4 inch back in the day. But after high school, I took a tour of Sheridan College. Sheridan College is pretty much well known for their computer animation course, but they were, you know, they're also well known for their media and their advanced television. And I walked in and I saw, here's another thing that's going to make me sound old again. I saw nonlinear editing on D-Vision way back in the day. And it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. And I'm like, that's what I got to do. I want to learn how to do that. Of course, they made me sit through 2 years of doing the old splicing on the Steenbeck and things like that. But in the third year, I got to use Media Composer version 5.5. So that was, you know, people, when I tell people, you know, they say, oh, I've been using Media Composer since version 5. They're like, what, you've been using it for like 3 or 4 years? I'm like, no. It got to 12 and reset itself and started with Media Composer Adrenaline version 1. So technically it's at version 20 now. So I've been using it for 15 versions. So I've been using it a long time.
I got a story for you on that Star Trek thing. I did an episode of Star Trek Voyager, and I know you did the same thing when you did the Universal Studio thing, where I got to beam up. I got to stand in the pod. I got to beam up, and of course they cut that scene.
No,
of course.
They cut that scene. They actually give you a little badge at the end of that scene when you actually get to beam up on that episode. It was so much fun, and they cut it out.
So no one has
So
ever
if you ever
seen
see Star Trek Voyager, they cut out that scene.
How could they do that to you?
I know. It was just so much fun.
Do you still have the bad
I'll look for your hand in that episode.
Well, that leads to the next question. You got bitten when you were a Klingon, so to speak.
Yes,
but what brought you to Avid?
Well, I mean, back in the day, I mean, there was really only a couple players back in the day. You know, there was, like I said, there was D-Vision, which, I mean, at the time was, we only really sort of got an intro because that was sort of the first little foray into nonlinear editing, and then it was Avid. And I mean, pretty much after that, Avid was really the only player. You know, Premiere was around back then. I mean, it obviously wasn't sort of, you know, the juggernaut that it's become today. But it was an Avid world back then, and, you know, that was really the only option. And for the longest time, that's what I did. And, you know, as we all know, as the job changes and we do different things, you know, other things came along. And for the longest time, I'd actually switched to Final Cut. I was a Final Cut guy for probably about 4 years. Sort of, I'll say, I'm going to get lots of hate mail for this. I don't want to say in the Final Cut heyday, but it's sort of in that 5, 6, 7 sort of span, in the Final Cut Studio span, you know, it was really making headwaves, and you know, it was really giving Avid, and I mean, sort of Premiere at that point, it's you know, kind of started to get in the race and was starting to accelerate at that point. But it was really sort of the Avid and Final Cut battle at that time, and I was doing a lot of Final Cut, and you know, at the end of the day, most of the work that I've done has been in collaborative environments. So, and, you know, that is really, I'm not going to say that's really where Avid excels, because, I mean, Avid excels at editing in general. But one thing that Avid has, obviously, as people have known over the last, you know, let's say 10 years, they've really started to focus on that collaborative workflow. And that has really been, you know, the focus of sort of a lot of the work that I've done has been working with 6 or 7 other editors on many of the same projects. And that's really where, you know, Avid has now started to dominate.
Now, you're based out of Toronto, right?
Yep, Toronto, Canada.
Is it pretty much an Avid town, or is it now becoming an Avid Premiere town? Is it? I know a lot of people still use Final Cut.
In my opinion, it's still a pretty Avid-dominated town. I mean, you know, we're sort of in that interesting kind of a flux period, which is, you know, Apple obviously took the direction that they took a couple years ago with how they wanted to take Final Cut, and Premiere has now sort of gotten into the driver's seat with Avid to sort of be in that race. And it's kind of become an interesting race, because for the longest time that was Final Cut's seat. And I'm not saying that Final Cut's not in the race as well, don't get me wrong. But, you know, at the time it was really one of those, if you could sit down and edit in front of Final Cut and you went into a Media Composer facility, you could make your way through Media Composer. They were very similar in how they functioned. Well, now Premiere has kind of stepped into that place. If you're a Media Composer editor, you can sit down in Premiere and pretty much get up to speed pretty quick. If you're a Premiere editor, you can sit down. I mean, obviously you're not going to know all the bells and whistles, but you can pretty much get up to speed pretty quickly when editing on either system. Now, Final Cut has obviously taken things, you know, a little bit differently, sort of in the past few years. So.
But I want to come back to this, Kevin, because I'm going to contrast something. Grant, who's in our live chat, writes that Final Cut is so easy to use now, and its functionality for sharing is better than Avid and faster. I can't see the hoo-ha anymore, which gets to something I'm really curious about. There's been, for decades, the whole which NLE is the best and the NLE wars. Where do you stand on this?
Tell me you hate it.
Well, you know what? It's interesting that he said sharing, because I'm not talking about necessarily sharing. I'm talking about a collaborative workflow where you might have 10 editors working on a project at the same time. I'm not talking about a couple editors sitting down. I'm going to edit some, and then, Larry, I'm going to pass it off to you, and then you're going to do some stuff, and you're going to pass it back to me. I'm talking about editors sharing storage, sharing media, working on a project at the same time.
You can do that, right, Larry, in Final Cut with an XN?
No. Now, you can't have multiple people in the same library at the same time. You can access the library from an accent, but you can't have multiple people. No, here, Kevin's absolutely right. The collaboration within Avid beats everything in Premiere, with possible exception of Adobe Anywhere, but beats Premiere and beats Final Cut. So that's a good point.
We're not talking necessarily about sharing. We're talking about a collaborative multi-editor environment. Now, as far as, I mean, what's better? I mean, that's like me saying, you know, what's a better apple? Is a Fuji apple better? Or is a, you know, Red Delicious better? One thing that I always try to tell Final Cut editors, which is, you know, the one thing that's very tempting about Final Cut, and don't get me wrong, it's, you know, a lot of editors say, you know, oh, I can get in there and I can, you know, cut circles around you, and that's great and everything. But one thing I always tell all Final Cut editors, because Final Cut is now, it is a different beast than it used to be, and I say beast in the most respective terms. So what I always tell Final Cut editors is that you might be the best Final Cut editor, Final Cut Pro 10 editor in the world, but you better get out there and you better learn Media Composer, because Avid is entrenched in a lot of production facilities, especially in LA, especially on the bigger productions. And if you want to get in on those productions, it's not like I said, back in the day where I know Final Cut, so Avid works very similar. It's a very different workflow now. So, you know, get out there, and if you want to get into these facilities that have Avid, make sure you know it backwards, forwards, upside down. And, you know, a lot of people, I always hear people, you know, talk about, you know, the rigidity of Avid. I don't like, you know, Media Composer because it's very, you know, I don't have the flexibility that I have in other applications. But I actually kind of tell people that believe it or not, that's a blessing in disguise. Because one thing I always tell people, you know, when they go in to set their project up, people immediately always think that when they're setting their project up, they're setting it up to how their footage was shot. And I tell people, I say, don't think that. Think of how you're setting your project up as to what the final file that you're going to deliver to your client is. If you think that way, and you're bringing in media, because again, much like in Premiere, much like in Final Cut, you can bring in any type of media into, you know, your Media Composer timeline to work with, but that Media Composer timeline is fixed to what you're going to be delivering at the very end of your production. So if you remember that, Media Composer is essentially kind of giving you the road to drive down and saying, this is the way you're going to drive so that no matter what happens, you're going to get to the destination the way that you need to.
Now, I want to be clear here that you don't work for Avid. You're an editor that just is using Edited. But recently, Avid's been having a real hard time financially. And there's been a lot of talk of the beleaguered Avid. Is it worth editors even learning the software given the difficulties Avid is going through?
Let's put it this way. Obviously, like I said, I don't work for the company. I can't speak for the company. But like I said, I don't really necessarily think that Avid's going through any tough times like everybody is saying that they are. I mean, like I said, at the end of the day, you know, if you take a look, take a look at the Academy Awards this year. Take a look at the films that were nominated for film editing. You've got American Sniper, you've got Boyhood, Grand Budapest Hotel, Imitation Game, and Whiplash that won the Academy Award, all edited in Avid. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, the big players that are out there are still using Avid, and, you know, I wouldn't consider myself to be, you know, the big player because I'm, you know, not editing the Hollywood features, but I'm doing promo editing, I'm doing commercials, I'm doing things like that. And for me, Avid is still the tool of choice.
Why did it take Avid so long to get into 4K?
That's a great question, and that's one that people like to give Avid a bashing for. I mean, obviously, again, it's only my own personal opinion, but what people need to remember, you know, about a company like Avid is that, you know, Avid has different, you know, has two very different and distinct ecosystems. I mean, there's technically three if you want to include storage in that, but I mean, storage can kind of flip back and forth between the editing side and the post-audio side, but really, there's a lot of factors that Avid needed to take into consideration, such as, you know, interplay, which is, you know, obviously asset management for Media Composer. You know, that's something that Avid has to keep in mind when they're developing their software. So they need to make sure it works great in Media Composer, but how is this going to transfer into interplay asset management? Because you need to make sure that all that, you know, 2K, Ultra HD, 4K media is being indexed the way that it needs to be so all the editors can access it. They need to make sure that all that 4K, obviously audio is, you know, I'll say audio is audio, but they need to make sure that if I'm going to be sending 4K work over to, you know, Pro Tools, that the files that I'm sending to Pro Tools get over there, you know, in one step. So, you know, again, just my own opinion, but, you know, Avid needs to, when they're designing stuff, look at the bigger picture. They can't just look at it as, well, let's just put this in a Media Composer, because suddenly you're going to have a system that's running, you know, let's say doing 4K work at a facility, but then you're going to have another system that maybe hasn't been upgraded yet. So there's just all these different things that they needed to take into consideration when doing this. Again, just my own opinion.
Well, at least he has an opinion. It's
Kevin does have an opinion. Kevin, I just wanted to let you know that I always watch the tutorials that you do. You put them up, what, about once a week now?
Once a week.
The one, the background animations. Oh, so good. It was so good, so much fun. No, good job. I loved that one. It was just so much fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to talk
and
about...
you can find those, by the way, on... You can find those on what, PVC, and I think you got a Vimeo blog or on the Avid site, or but anyway, Kevin puts these things up about once a week. Go ahead.
Once a week. You can actually find them youtube.com/user/Media Composer 101, user singular.
Yeah, so you can learn Media Composer for free from him. So thank you, Kevin.
I mean, that's that's something that I tried to do. I mean, because really, sort of for me, the tutorials got started out at the Creative Cow, you know. So obviously, I want to give a big thanks to them, because I mean, they sort of, you know, Ron Lindeboom and Kathleen sort of gave me the freedom to. They said, you know, media, you know, Avid is something that's important that people learn, and you know, I did 93 tutorials for them that have had somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million views across all their, you know, all their channels. So I mean, and I still get people that email me, you know, every day saying, I just watch your tutorials on the Cow and I have a question for you. And, you know, so now, you know, I try to direct them to the, you know, to the new site. But I mean, there's still people out there checking out. And that was version 6 of Media Composer. We're now up to version 8.3 of Media Composer. So, you know, people are still out there finding those older tutorials.
Before I talk about how Avid interacts with other software, you started to talk about what Avid does that other NLEs can't, and you stressed how important collaboration, multiple editors working in the same project at the same time is. Off the top of your head, what are some other key features for you that Avid has that we can't get from Premiere or Final Cut?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it's an interesting situation that we're in, sort of in the Avid world, because, you know, for the longest time, you know, we've had pretty much most of the features at our disposal that we really need. I mean, one thing that I think, you know, Avid is doing now that I think is kind of interesting, it's kind of like what Adobe did with After Effects, which is you know, with After Effects, we didn't have the greatest keyer in After Effects. So instead of Adobe spending all this time to say, let's develop a new keyer, they turn to, I believe it's the Foundry, and they license Keylight to put into After Effects. And it's kind of like what they've done with Imagineer Systems with Mocha and what they've done with Cinema 4D. And, you know, I mean, it's one thing that, you know, Avid has, you know, great support from is their partner companies like Boris Effects and other companies like that, you know, that really give us tools, you know, in our timeline that is a great sort of, I mean, it lets the guys at Avid do what the guys at Avid do, and lets, you know, the team at Boris Effects develop these great tools for us, like, you know, it could be Flicker Fixer, it could be, you know, 3D elements, it could be, you know, all this, you know, great type of stuff, you know, to let us fix the problems that, you know, normally editors, and don't get me wrong, you know, I love After Effects, I'm a huge After Effects user, but a lot of times I just need to get in and do stuff quick in my timeline, and I don't want to be constantly sending stuff to After Effects, even though, you know, the fact that we have Pro Import, you know, After Effects, you know, formerly Automatic Duck inside of After Effects is fantastic. Because I just exported an AAF with no media. I go, boom, I imported. There's all my Media Composer layers inside of After Effects like in 30 seconds, which is really good. What's
the one thing in Avid that is lacking that you so want and you dream about? Is there anything?
I don't think that there's anything necessarily, because like I said, the partner companies have really stepped up and really filled in a lot of the gaps. It's like, you know, for example, we have the, you know, the Marquee Title tool, which, I mean, I remember back in the day when the Marquee Title tool, you know, required its own dedicated workstation. You know, the workstation alone was like, you know, $25,000 or $30,000. You know, and now all of that 3D titling and stuff like that can be done with effects like Boris Effects' you know, 3D objects, or New Blue Effects' Titler Pro. You know, and New Blue Titler Pro, you know, comes
that's
with,
a brilliant
you know, your Media
program.
Composer subscription. So, you know, editors might already have some of these tools at their disposal and they don't even realize it yet.
And New Blue Effects, I mean, they do it for all the NLEs, but they do brilliant work.
Yeah, they do.
Their marketing team lacks.
How do you move files from Avid to DaVinci Resolve?
That's actually, you know, the one thing I love about, you know, finishing in a program like Resolve is that the functionality is pretty much the same, much like in After Effects. I mean, in Resolve, we can basically take an AAF from our Media Composer timeline, whether it's, you know, a 30-second spot or a half-hour show, export the AAF. Now, this is in, you know, HD or higher than HD. We can do all the way up to, you know, 4K. We can export an AAF, basically go into Resolve. We can link to all the media that we've already digitized. So this is all DNX HD or DNX HR if we're doing higher than HD. It all appears right in Resolve to do our color grade. And then we can actually render out MXF files right back to Media Composer so that when we export when the AAF file gets exported, it's just a link to inside of Resolve. So the Resolve workflow, you know, is a really, really good, solid workflow for Media Composer editors to do, like to use, you know, for color grading. It's a fantastic tool. And the great thing is that, you know, I'll say for most of the stuff that Media Composer editors want to do, the free option will work perfectly. The only thing they need to keep in mind is that, I mean, if they happen to be doing stereoscopy, you've got to pay for that option. But if you happen to be doing any of the DCI resolutions, so the digital cinema resolutions, that requires the full version of Resolve. So something to keep in the back of your head.
Yeah, but come on, it's $999 for goodness sake.
If you're doing stuff for the cinema, I know it's $999 is a really good deal, and it's funny because I mean I'm taking a look at and of course now the program just escaped my brain, and I have it sitting here beside me somewhere. Fusion, that's the one. And Fusion, what's very cool about Fusion is that Fusion actually has a Media Composer plugin. So you can basically, in Media Composer, drag the Fusion plugin onto your clip. You click one button, Fusion opens, do the work you want to do, you say save, and boom, it appears in your Media Composer.
And as we speak, they're working on a Mac version.
That's true.
So there you go. So, I mean, that's, you know, just, you know, a lot of companies are starting to look, and I mean, let's put it this way: if Media Composer was as quote unquote dead as, you know, some people like to say that it is, these companies wouldn't be investing a lot of time to make these things for Media Composer. But I mean, obviously, Media Composer is still a big market.
Thanks for all you do, Kevin. I really learn a lot from you, as does my son, who watched that same tutorial just the other day.
And Kevin, where can people find the tutorials?
They can find the tutorials over at youtube.com/user/Media Composer 101. And I just want to thank, you know, the great team at Video Guys for being a sponsor, because they've been fantastic. Yeah, and they can check it out. They can subscribe to it there.
And
We've only
Kevin,
had the
I'm going to cut you off.
months. We've hit about 20,000 viewers so far.
Kevin McAuliffe is a senior editor with Extreme Reach Toronto, a avid community leader. And Kevin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.
Stay warm.